Hello, my name is Father Tighe, and this is our 41st segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. And in this segment, we continue our journey after the destruction of Jerusalem, how they reevaluated it in the light of the destruction of Jerusalem. So we look up here and we see our theme, Judah's journey of faith in light of Jerusalem destroyed, recorded by inspired Deuteronomic writers, and they prepare the way for the light of the cross. So there's an essential connection between the light of Deuteronomy and the light of the cross. Now we go back up here to the third line, and I would prefer to use Jerusalem crucified, which I will after this, because crucified now means that when Jesus was opened on the cross, a light shone, radiated out, and deeper enlightenment and understanding came to all of us. The same way it came to the Judeans back in the time of the exile in Babylon. Okay, now we go to our next screen. Deuteronomy is the most quoted book in the New Testament. There is nothing quoted more. It's quoted something like 70 times. You cannot understand the Gospels without the light of Deuteronomy in context of Jerusalem destroyed. You have to refer to Deuteronomy, but more important, you have to know the context of Deuteronomy as Jerusalem was destroyed. It is important to know the prophets also. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Deutero, we said, means second. Deutero, Isaiah, second Isaiah. These three prophets are extremely important who enlightened the Deuteronomic reform. It helps us to understand how the church crucified Judaic morality 650 years later in the light of the cross. They go together. All right, we go on to our next screen. The first deportation in 598 had the talented 10%, including Deuteronomic scribes. This is very important. They were talented. Because they surrendered and were not farmers, but skilled Levites. We're going to see the Levites were all over Judea and Jerusalem because Levites were not allowed to have land and they were never allowed to be farmers. So they picked up other skills, like they were musicians, they were jewelers, they were craftsmen, they were also tailors and things like that, anything to do with the religious services. Also, there were Judean landowners and bankers and very skilled people. So they got good jobs in Babylon, and this is important to the future of Judaism. This was the leadership that could shepherd Judah back to life if they accepted heroic sense of duty. Now we go to our next screen, and we talk about Ezekiel and the second deportation. The second deportation came naked and shaven, and Ezekiel used that situation. He used the sad situation to criticize the first deportees for their poor leadership. Before the exile, they did not pastor their people. They should have been the leadership. They did not bind up wounds or seek out the lost. These are the types of words Ezekiel used. This image of shepherd returns them to their roots beyond the time they were farmers back when they were 40 years in the wilderness. Now, in exile, they felt like dead bones, but God's Spirit could bring them back to life if they zealously observed Passover and the law. We have a beautiful old song like that. They can make it playful, but it talks about the dead bones coming back to life and walking again.
Them bones gonna walk around. Them bones gonna walk around. Them bones gonna walk around. Now hear the word of the Lord.
Deuteronomy is presented as a speech. Now the whole book is presented, it's edited as a book with Moses talking to the people at the end of their journey through the wilderness, just before they enter the promised land, and he's about to die. He reminds them of Exodus. Exodus happened 40 years before when they came out of Egypt. They went down to Mount Sinai and they received the commandments from God. That was 40 years previously. Deuteronomy, 40 years later, says, the Lord made a covenant with us at Horeb Sinai. Moses is saying, and he says, not with your fathers. He's saying, not with the generation that might have died in the wilderness, but you, even those you born during the journey, but with us today. And this is very important, that the covenant with Moses is eternal. And the Jewish people, each generation comes out of slavery each year, just like Christians participate in the sacrifice of Christ every time they go to Mass. It's the same thing. They were slaves redeemed to reveal God's life-giving justice. This is very important. God redeemed slaves, which means their experience of slavery prepared them to do what? To share God's justice with the world, giving justice in contrast to the dark injustice of false gods. Jews were people with a mission. Because they had been slaves, they were conscious of the suffering of oppressed people, so they were very strong for justice for the poor. And that's what we want to emphasize now. Now we go to our next screen. Deuteronomy 5. You shall make no image of anything in heaven on earth. If you're going to be focused on your mission, you cannot have idols because they deflect your attention. Images excite your yetzer, divide your heart, and isolate in emptiness and depression. You feel isolated and depressed, separated from one another. But if one is forbidden to see an image, one cannot see image of God in others. We'll come back to this, but if you can't see the image of God in others and you don't want them to see the image of God in you, then you have put limits and boundaries on the image and likeness of God's love. Thus it puts limits and boundaries on love. Even God's love is limited because God did not forgive Adam and Eve. He ejected them from the garden, and he allowed the destruction of Jerusalem. So it is very important from here on, Jews say only God can forgive, and he's pretty strong about what he wants. Now we go on. Deuteronomy summarized in the Shema prayer. In Deuteronomy, in chapter 6, is the Shema prayer, which is the whole prayer of Judaism, and it's only in Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one. That's the whole point, the oneness. You shall love Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. If you're going to have oneness in your life and you're going to stay focused on your duties and responsibilities, you have to have one God, and your heart must be on that one God. And you must love him with all your might. I command you today to cut these words into your heart. Very rarely do they translate to cut these words into your heart. But this is emphasizing that love of God hurts. We are sinners, and God's love is so strong it cuts into our hearts. And when Peter spoke on Pentecost, right after that, St. Luke in Acts of the Apostles says, he cut into their hearts. His words cut their hearts. And that's very important to the continuation of what we are doing here. Deuteronomy 7:3, you shall not intermarry, for they will turn your sons' hearts away from heroic duty to the gods of fantasy. And it's the gods of fantasy that disfocus us. Now we go on to our next screen. You are a people consecrated to Yahweh. Consecrated means set apart. A people peculiarly his own. Now peculiar means that they must be different from other people, very different. And in order to be different, they separated themselves. They segregated themselves in the ghetto. They put themselves in the ghetto. And they tried to make themselves invisible. Not only invisible by place, but the way they clothed. They wanted themselves to be unattractive. Only the men had to leave the ghetto and go out into the world. So they were the head of the family, means the visible member of the family. But as good servants, and they wanted to achieve this for the king of Babylon, they were like invisible servants. A good servant is invisible. He does his work without being noticed. And then he leaves, and he doesn't gossip, and he doesn't talk about it. And the Jewish people learned to be perfect servants. They knew how to be invisible, and they celebrated, and that's what peculiar means. Okay, now, we go on there. Solomon began assimilation into the pagan cultures in 950 BC when he built the pagan places for his wives. Remember, he made contracts or treaties with pagan kings, and then they exchanged their daughters in marriage to seal the treaty, and then they had to be nice to each other's daughters. So Solomon, with 1,000 wives, because he had 1,000 treaties, started doing pagan things to make them happy. This destroyed the country. Polygamy, like porneia, caused divided hearts and division of Israel from Judah. Remember, at his death, it divided. Deuteronomy 12, there's to be one sanctuary in the future of sacrifice, focused on one God. And Judah is now married to the one God. So just as there's monogamy in man and woman, there's monogamy of God's people with their one God. And now we come to our theme and we review it, we look at it. Judah's journey of faith in light of Jerusalem crucified, recorded by inspired Deuteronomic writers, prepares the way for the light of the cross.